Well, thank you again, everyone, for coming to the ISMS, the second ISMS. I think it was a big success. And as we had advertised before, we had hoped to have a Chinese delegation attend, and it was looking really good right up to the last minute when they ran into some red tape, unfortunately, on the Chinese side. So this wasn't a problem with our government. It was actually a problem with their government, and it kind of illustrates how difficult it is sometimes with all this international cooperation, even with all this international cooperation that we were talking about this morning. So I was supposed to originally introduce the speaker. The speaker was going to be the chief of their foreign affairs department at their equivalent of the Johnson Space Center in Beijing, and she was going to give an overview of the Chinese activities in space. I am somewhat less qualified to do that, but since I was going to introduce the speaker, the duty fell to me to do the best I could. So if actually it might work better if we turn off some of these lights. You might be able to see the slides better. So if I could ask some of the folks to hit some of the lights here. Nobody makes regular switches anymore, I don't think. My wife installed some of these in my house, I think. I can't, in our house. Used to be my house. Yeah, you're right, you're right. Somebody over here had it right. There we go. Thank you very much. Well, I told you in the beginning of this weekend that by the end of the weekend you're going to get sick of me. So, you know, there's no... Oh, there you go. No surprise, you know who I am now. My name is Leroy Chow, and I'm an astronaut. I'm also the chair of the user panel, and I work with John Clark on the user panel for NSBRI. But I was an astronaut working for NASA for 15 years, and during that time I had the good fortune to fly on 4 different space missions, including space shuttles, and also served as the commander of the International Space Station. Got to do several spacewalks in both the American and the Russian suits, and had just had a wonderful career in space. I grew up in the very beginning during the space race. Yuri Gagarin flew after I was born. I wasn't old enough to know about it at the time, but history making, certainly looking back, I knew about Yuri Gagarin and his flight on Vostok 1, followed just a few weeks later by American Alan Shepard and his flight on his Mercury Redstone. And I followed those early missions when I was old enough to understand what was happening, and with great interest. But it was really the Apollo moon program that captured my interest. I was an 8-year-old kid watching the first Apollo moon landing, and that's when I first got inspired to want to be an astronaut. And I can remember like it was yesterday watching the lunar module approach the surface of the moon and touch down on the moon, and then hours later watching Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin take the very first steps on the moon. And that's when it started for me, the big dream that you heard Dave Williams talk about today in our panel and yesterday's panel about having this dream. Well, that's when it started for me. As an 8-year-old kid, I knew even then that the world had changed, and I wanted to be one of those guys. Well, I worked really hard, and in 1990, and the guys who've known me for a while get a laugh out of this, this is my 1990 selection photo. This is almost 20 years and 20 pounds ago, so you know, he bears a little more resemblance to my infant son any more than to me, but I'd give some folks a laugh. But this is an exciting time coming in 1990 and realizing my first step in my dream of getting selected to be an astronaut. And 4 years later, with Don Thomas and Chiaki Mukai, who are here with us during this weekend, during this conference, we got to fly together on Space Shuttle Columbia on STS-65, a 2-week mission to the internet. 2-week mission using a Space Lab module as kind of like a mini space station, performing a lot of life science experiments in addition to microgravity experiments on materials and other fundamental research. Well, after 10 years and 3 shuttle flights, I went on to fly 2 more shuttle flights, getting a chance to do some spacewalks, and also getting a chance to fly on Mission 3A, STS-92, to go up and help build the space station. We installed 2 new pieces and got to do a couple of more spacewalks than that, but it had reached kind of a crossroads in my career. I'd flown 3 shuttle missions, spent 10 years at NASA. At that point, I was invited to join what was known then as the Expedition Corps, continues to be known as the Expedition Corps, and this was a big deal. And as I told you this morning in my panel, this was a huge deal, not just because I might be spending 4 to 6, what turned out to be 6.5 months in space, but the preparation. I had to learn Russian, and I had to learn Russian to the proficiency that I could operate as a co-pilot in the Soyuz spacecraft. I had to spend literally half my time in Russia over the next 3.5 years traveling, spending 1 month in Star City and 1 month in Houston, back and forth, back and forth. And back in those days, we did it all in economy class, so that was a factor to think about too. But as I mentioned this morning, one of the things that came out of that was this experience of actually living in another culture and getting to, feel like I was actually a Russian, understanding their jokes, making some good friends out there that are very close friends, lifelong friends, participating in their cultural events and understanding some of their superstitions. Very careful today when I met Dr. Nechayev to jump over the threshold before shaking his hand. But I got to fly on Soyuz TMA-5 with Salyzhin Sharipov, and we spent 6.5 months on the International Space Station during Expedition 10. Came back from that mission, and shortly thereafter, I left NASA, and I'm doing a variety of things now, including working with the NSPRI. But just a few photographs from space. This is what really captures the imagination, is when you're up there looking at the Earth. You talk to anyone who's flown in space, they'll tell you that's the best thing, is looking back at the Earth. This is, of course, the southern tip of Florida. This is for you, Jeannie. You might be able to recognize where your old home was there. And these photos haven't been retouched. These are the actual, this is really what it looks like, very dramatic colors, vibrant colors from space. Scott Parzynski is on an Everest expedition, astronaut Scott Parzynski, and we heard from Christian yesterday, and at the beginning of our meeting, very exciting to have that live telephone link video link with him on Everest. And this is the Himalayas in the foreground, and they look pretty tiny from space, but of course we know they're pretty huge. This is the view looking into China. And it's kind of appropriate since I'm supposed to talk about the Chinese space program. This is a picture of Beijing, and as you can see, the very center is the Forbidden City. Of course, that's where the old Chinese emperors used to live. China kind of invented gunpowder, I suppose, and early rockets, of course, spent a long time making fireworks and played catch-up a little bit later. But in 2003, in September of 2003, Yang Liwei became the first Chinese national astronaut, and China became only the third nation in the world able to launch astronauts into space. Here is Yang Liwei after a successful flight aboard the Shenzhou capsule. How did it all begin? Well, there was somebody that most of the people in the room probably know about, but maybe there are a few of us who really don't know too much about this gentleman. His name is Qian Xuesen, and he was, no kidding, rocket scientist. He was born in China at the turn of the last century, and he came to the U.S. to studied at Caltech, earned his PhD from Caltech. He went to become the youngest professor at MIT, returned to Caltech, and he started working with Theodor von Karman, who started the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and he was a protege of von Karman's. And so they started working on rockets together. He was a he's still alive, actually. He's in his 90s, and he's living in Beijing. He's still alive, very intelligent and smart guy. At the end of World War II, the president asked von Karman to form a small team and go to post-war Germany to find Wernher von Braun, all his deputies, and bring back all the key German scientists and as many V2 parts as they could find. And so the U.S. Army actually put a colonel's uniform on Tren and sent him off to post-war Germany with Theodor von Karman. They found von Braun and his team. They brought back a lot, trainloads of equipment that was left over from Peenemünde and other facilities. And pretty soon, the U.S. was launching V2 rockets out of White Sands Missile Range and doing our own rocket research. Well, Qian kept working with von Karman and the Jet Propulsion Lab, and he was working on U.S. missile systems, including the Titan missile, Titan Intercontinental Ballistic Missile. And it was at that time in 1950 that Senator McCarthy started was the symbol of the Red Scare at the time, the search for communists that had infiltrated the country. It was a time of great distrust and paranoia, and Qian came under investigation. Tren came under investigation in 1950, and this kind of controversy started swirling of what to do with him and whether or not he was a Chinese spy. And in fact, this went on for 5 years. In the last 2 years, he and his family and his 2 children, who were born in the U.S., were held under house arrest for 2 years. And in fact, Chen had applied for U.S. citizenship before this, loving JPL and enjoying working under von Karman and working on U.S. missile systems. But in the end, the U.S. actually deported Chen and his whole family back to China, and that was in 1955. He was welcomed in China by Chairman Mao and the Chinese government with open arms, and at that time was then charged with building up the Chinese missile program. And the Chinese had absolutely nothing. He started from a base of zero, and in only 5 years, in 1960, produced the Chinese version of the V-2 rocket. He went on to produce many weapon systems that are known everywhere as almost a household name of examples like the silkworm missile. We've all heard of silkworm missiles. And in fact, he was the father of every single missile system that China's ever developed, including the China's first intercontinental ballistic missile, the Dongfeng 2. First operational one. In fact, in 1960, I think 65 or 66, I can't remember exactly, China kind of irresponsibly, maybe very irresponsibly, did a live missile test with one of these Dongfeng 2 missiles, armed with a live warhead on it. Fortunately, impacted in its targeted area at the Lop Nor test range. This was a missile that could carry 22 kilotons, and from there on, more and more advances came. This was in the span of only 10 years. In 10 years, the China had gone from zero to ICBM capable, and ironically, the U.S. government created this. If we had not deported Chen back to China, even Chinese experts will say, they admit that they don't know how far behind they would be right now. So that's kind of something to think about. It kind of goes back to a subject we talked on this morning about the importance of thinking globally and thinking about what you're doing, not just in your small context, but in the whole world. Well, the Dongfeng series of missiles were the basis for the Long March series of rockets. And aboard the Chinese Long March 2F is their man-rated rocket, and mated to the Shenzhou capsule, formed Chinese launch capability for launching humans into space. Well, China's ambitions for manned spaceflight actually started in 1968. And it stalled because of the Cultural Revolution. So again, their own internal politics tripped them up. Cultural Revolution, of course, a huge disaster for China in so many ways, but it completely stopped their manned space ambitions. And it was not picked up again until 1992. And the first astronauts were selected around 1998. This is their selection photograph. And as I mentioned this morning, in September of 2006, just 3 years after Yang Liwei's first flight, I had an opportunity to visit the Chinese Astronaut Research Center in Beijing, and got to meet Yang Liwei, who's on your left, and Fei Junlong on your right, who was the commander of their second mission. Got to spend the day with them and look through all of their facilities. As you can see, their facilities are very nice, very first class. It's about 7 years old, spotless. You could eat off the floor. The gentleman in the white shirt is Director Chen Truongguan. He's the director of the Astronaut Center of China, kind of the equivalent of the center director of JSC maybe, or certainly maybe more accurately, I should say, he's more like the commanding general of Star City. Well, I got to crawl around all their stuff. They let me take some photographs. They wouldn't let me shoot inside of their Shenzhou capsule, but I can tell you it looks very nice. It's a little bit bigger than the Soyuz that I flew in. By my guess, I would say maybe 25% bigger. So it was clear to me, though, that China is here to stay in the space business. One of the most striking things that I observed during my visit was that when we went into the walled city, and it's like a base. It's very much like Star City. It's a walled base with guards on the outside. When we went inside, the lawns and the trees were all very well manicured. Shows that they have some money here to keep things up. And also the street signs. This is what struck me. The street signs were bilingual. They were in Chinese and in English. So clearly the center had been built with the intention of doing some kind of cooperation with the West. Well, China's made no secret that they intend to launch and operate a space station. I got to see this mock-up of their, actually it's a little more than a mock-up, of the Salyut class station. They had just finished conducting a 60-day life support test, having individuals inside the chamber for that long, testing what they said at the time was a closed-loop life support system. Maybe there's a loss in understanding of what closed-loop life support really meant, because I would be really surprised if they had gotten that far, because none of us have really demonstrated a truly closed life support system, but they're probably going along that road. China intends to continue operating its Shenzhou capsule. They have another mission planned this year after the Olympics in 2008. They're going to launch probably a 3-man crew and do their first EVA in a suit that, in some photographs that have just been released, this isn't one of them. This is actually me outside of the International Space Station. But their suit looks an awful lot like an Orlan suit, so our Russian friends should be impressed with that. That's, what do they say? The impersonation is the sincerest form of flattery, right? And as I said, they plan to operate this small space station that will be launched sometime in the future. In October of last year, they launched the Chang'e spacecraft to the moon. And, you know, as people who work in the technical area of flying in space, you know that going to the moon is not a simple feat. It takes a pretty high level of sophistication. The Japanese had also launched and operated an orbiter just before this flight. And so now there are at least two orbiters flying around the moon doing some mapping, sending back some spectacular images. And China has announced plans to land a rover, soft land a rover on the moon by 2012, and to fly a soil return mission by 2017. Now, as far as their manned ambitions for the moon, China has not publicly come out and stated that they're planning a manned mission to the moon. I think they're being very cautious because, as with all national space programs, one of the top priorities of driving forces is national prestige, and you've got to be careful about not biting off too much right at the beginning. You've got to keep yourself credible. So I think they've kind of set out these logical steps, but you know, in Chinese culture, the moon is very important, and it would be very surprising to me if they're not at least thinking about or starting to plan for a human mission to the moon. And of course, as you heard from Mike Coates yesterday, the U.S. is moving forward on the Constellation program. And of course, the question is very fitting that we had the topic this morning in the panel. Should we be doing this together or should we be doing this separately? I have my own views, and that is that we should be doing things together. I think we've learned from our cooperation with our Russian partners in the International Space Station that the advantages of working together outweigh the disadvantages. Not just, and I'm not just talking about spaceflight. You know, I think we've seen some of the obvious advantages of working together, and those of us that have been involved in some of the ISS aspects of the program over the last several years know some of the difficulties. And there's no question, as Walt correctly pointed out, it's going to cost more and it's going to extend the schedule out a bit. But if you take a step back and look at the bigger picture of what it means to, have countries have a common ground of something they can work together, my belief is that it's worth it to work together to fly to the moon. So who knows? As also another gentleman pointed out this morning, there's a lot of a sense of instability, if you will, in the country right now because we've got an election coming up. We don't know who's going to win. It's going to be a tight race, just like the Super Bowl was this year, I suppose. And but at any rate, things will change. I think that's the one thing we can be sure of. No matter who wins the White House, things will change for the space program. So I'd like to be optimistic, and I think I am a little optimistic that things will get better for all of us, and that we can work together, and hopefully space will be a good common ground for us. Thank you very much. We can have the lights back on. I think we probably have a few minutes for questions before folks have to take off and try to catch their planes or hit happy hour. Yes.
Do they have any plans to incorporate women into their astronaut corps?
Do they have plans to incorporate women into their astronaut corps? You know, they don't have any women right now in their astronaut corps, at least none that they've admitted to. I know that there's been talk of that, and I believe they will. I think they will. They're just, there are certain problems, whether, that's one of those questions. And of course, we'd like to be gender and otherwise blind, but the fact is that women anthropometrically are different. You've got to think about logistics to be able to make, things fit for women. You just know that from clothing. You can't just get a small shirt and put it on a woman and expect it to fit. So I think they will, though, because they're very aware of what I talked about earlier about the global eyes on them. And so for no other reason, I think they will incorporate women into the program. Another question? Yeah.
What is your sense of the Chinese willingness to work in an international environment?
What is my sense of the Chinese willingness to work in an international environment? Well, after they successfully launched Yang Liwei and Shenzhou 5, China came out publicly and said, we would like to join the ISS program. And it was actually the Americans that came back and said, at the time, the Americans said, well, their technology is not sophisticated enough, and so we don't want them in the program. And of course, that was a pretty big slap in the face. I think China's technology is pretty sophisticated. Of course, they borrowed a lot from the Russians. They've, I guess, begged, borrowed, or stealed technology from the Russians. But they make no secret of wanting to cooperate with the West. As I said, the street signs are in English and in Chinese, and even in informal discussions with the director and some of his deputies, they're very interested. They say they're collaborating with Europe right now on some areas like life support systems. You know, why would Europe be working with them on life support systems? You know, we're not really sure. But I think they're very keen on working with the West. That's my impression. Yes. Yeah.
Did they answer all your questions? And were there areas they didn't really want to share?
Yeah, were they completely open and answering questions and didn't want to share? Yeah, they certainly had areas they were sensitive about. They were asking me an awful lot of questions about EVA, knowing that I'd done a lot of EVAs, and since they were planning to do an EVA, when I was there in 2006 for the very first time, their water tank was still under construction. They showed me the building, and it wasn't, you could see right through it. It was just girders, and they were literally starting to build the water tank. So they were obviously very curious about it, and I had to be very careful not to violate any U.S. laws, ITAR laws, by revealing too much, so I could only talk about what was available and openly known about. So I decided to ask them a bunch of questions. I said, well, can I see your suit? Is it going to be based on an Orlon? Is it? And they were pretty cagey about it. They did not want to talk too much about their technology. So yes, they were pretty cautious about what they wanted me to see.
So you didn't get to see the suit?
I didn't get to see the suit. Yes.
Mike Coates commented that one of the barriers was that it's under the military. Did you get a sense of maybe that changing, or a part of the space program becoming a...
Right. Yeah. Mike Coates mentioned that part of the barrier, the question is about, Mike Coates mentioned that part of the barrier of working with China is that their space program's under the military, and what was my impression of that, or is that changing? As soon as you drive into the center, it is a base. They don't advertise it as a military base, but it's a walled city with two People's Liberation Army guards standing on little boxes outside, in full uniform. And so, the military is a part of their space program. There's no question. However, the director, Dr. Chen, from what I know, is a civilian. And certainly I've never seen him or photographs of him in a uniform, and I've never directly asked him, but if he is in the military, he's pretty quiet about it. My impression talking to other folks is that the program is slowly changing. I think China recognizes that in order to work with other civil space programs, it would be to their advantage to have it spin out from under the military. Certainly most of the specialists I met, none of them were wearing uniforms. And, so I'm optimistic that they will. I think they do realize that's a problem with working with the West, and I think they are in the process of, I hope they are, of spinning it out. Yeah, well.
The spacecraft looks like a slightly scaled up version of Soyuz. Is that a correct assumption?
Yeah, the spacecraft looks like a larger version of the Soyuz. Is that a correct assumption? I asked them that very question. I said, this looks an awful lot like a Soyuz. And knowing that would provoke a response. They admitted, of course, that they had Russian specialists, paid Russian specialists over to help them with a lot of the, bootstrap some of their, leapfrog some of their technology forward. But they were very insistent that every aspect of their spacecraft and everything else were produced indigenously. And I don't doubt that. I don't doubt also that it's heavily based on the Soyuz, as is their, if you look at their pressure suit, it looks an awful lot like a Sokol suit. If you look like their EVA suit of their first pictures, it looks an awful lot like an Orlon.
Let me inject something here. That when I was in Russia last year and talking to some of the curators at the museum, they insisted on everything in their beginning. Their spacecraft was homegrown too, and I finally reminded them that the R4 looks a whole lot like the V2.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, as you saw in the picture here, their version of the V2, their R4, looks an awful lot like a V2. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, Don.
What are the backgrounds of the Chinese astronauts?
The backgrounds of the Chinese astronauts, as far as I know, certainly the ones I met and the ones I've heard about are all in the People's Liberation Army Air Force. So they're all military folks. There has been speculation about women being included in future selections, and I don't know if they're going to be from the military or if they're going to start incorporating scientists, but it would be logical for them to do so. Just like our program in the U.S. and in the Soviet Union, in the very beginning, was all military pilots who were the first astronauts and cosmonauts. I think they're following the same model, but then they'll kind of open it up. Any more questions? Well, thank you all very much. I appreciate your attention, and good luck.